So as I kind of frequently say now, children's lessons are not always just for children, right? How easy is it not to say, I don't know him, but just not to say anything? Just keep your head down, keep your mouth closed, and just don't say anything. Yeah, not a whole lot of difference there. All right, boys and girls, we'll release you guys to the back. Preschool, all you guys, Miss Marcia, you're all back there. There's a lot of kids here today. That's a good thing, right? Especially since, guess what? Today what we're talking about, children, honor your parents. I think you moms and dads knew something today, didn't you? We're like, we're going to church today. So yeah, we're getting there. That's what they're going to learn about upstairs. That's what we're going to talk about down here. But before we jump in, a couple of announcements. One, for those that were here yesterday for helping with church cleanup, thank you very much. We got a lot accomplished. Special kudos to those that tackled the kitchen. Right? If you hadn't been in the kitchen, which you probably hadn't, it literally looked like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where like everybody just disappears and the kitchen's just like it was, right? We found stuff. You remember when we used to do coffee hour and we'd say, oh, this will keep till next week. Yeah. 54 weeks later, it's like, what is this? We think they were orange slices, but we're not sure. So hazmat suits were issued. We did the gym. Special thanks for those outside, clothing exchange. We had the preschool room, all that. So good job, guys. Youth group and 4th, 5th grade group. You do meet today, youth group. I promise I won't cancel it and not tell you about it this time. But we are meeting today, normal times. Biggest news for Easter, the Easter Vigil. Which starts at 7:16 next Saturday night, right? It's the service where we'll have readings from myself and James, and then our deacons and deaconesses will read and respond. Childcare is now available for that service, right? So if you were worried about, I don't know, right, for 0 to 4, childcare is now available for that. So we do need you guys to register for the Easter services. They're now in the app. You can open up your church app, click on the Connections tab, and then right down there you'll see Vigil, and then there's the 9 o'clock service, which is service only, and then the 10 o'clock, which is our picnic and egg hunt. And I was told today we have 2,700 Easter eggs. So yeah, parents, be prepared for sugar, right? And if you're out there and you're part of our church and you're not going to be able to make it, if you want to email us at church office, we'll set aside some for you. You can come pick them up, or maybe we can even drop those off to you so that you're in some way, shape, or fashion able to kind of participate in that, okay? So that's coming up. Easter Vigil, childcare available. Easter morning, childcare at 10:30. And then we mentioned this last week, but beginning as Connecticut kind of opens up to allow others to use the gym as well, there's in the church app, you'll now see a building use form in there if you want to use it for birthdays or stuff like that. There's some rules and stuff around it, but you can see those in there. All right, and then last but not least, if you do have our church app, you may have noticed and gotten some kind of notification this weekend or this week that church messaging had become available, right? There's a text function in there that is coming online, and we will be setting up over the next couple of weeks. So if you don't have our church app, that's a good reason to kind of download it, as we can set up a men's group and a women's group and a youth group and all that kind of stuff and be ready to go on that. It's another good way to communicate with one another. Okay. All right, so let's make the shift here to the message. That's enough announcements. We've been doing a lot of announcing here these last few weeks. Hey, we are working our way through the New City Catechism, right? So this little black book. If you don't have one of these, I mentioned this earlier, but there's some on this side table over here. You can grab one. We've gone through questions 1 through 9. We're on question 10. If you're not familiar with the Catechism, it's a series of questions and answers. Most people kind of associate them with the Catholic Church. This is not Catholic Catechism, right? It works its way through very Baptist theology, but we go through and it talked about creation and then who is God, and then now we're working through a section on what does God require of us. And we'll work our way then through as we get into the next section, what's wrong with the world? Like, why is the world so messed up? And we'll find the Christian answer for that. And then it'll go through and talk about Jesus, and we'll talk about the Holy Spirit and salvation. And it's 52 weeks. And here we are on week 10 as we work our way through the 10 Commandments. And what we've learned really as we've gotten into the 10 Commandments is we have a tendency to think about these things as just a list of do's and don'ts. right? Do this, don't do this. Do this, don't do this. But what we've kind of learned is that the 10 Commandments are more than just kind of a list of rules. They are God's instructions to us on how to love. Right? How do you love God, or how do you love your neighbor? Right? Love for the Christian is not this kind of empty concept that we get to fill up with whatever we want to put in it. Like, oh, I think love is this. Oh, I think love is this. Oh, I think love is this. God says, no, right? Christian, when it comes to loving God and loving your neighbor, this is what it looks like. And then he goes and he gives 10 broad commandments, 4 of which relate to our vertical relationship with God. God says, how do you love me? It's these 4 things, right? You have no other gods before me, right? I am first in your life, is what God says. That's how you love me. You love me by not making for yourself an idol. You worship me the way I've told you is appropriate to worship me. You don't misuse my name. You don't use it as a curse word. You don't use it flippantly, right? You treat my name reverently. And you give me 1 day a week to publicly and privately worship me. That's how you love God. Okay? And so, if you're really kind of curious and you look at those 4 criteria and you ask yourself, how am I doing on those? Right? But today, we make the transition from how do you love God to how do you love your neighbor? And one last point, really, before we make the shift, is I want you to notice when God came and he says, okay, I'm going to give you kind of some ideas, some commandments on how to love God and how to love your neighbor. Remember which one comes first. God says, how do you love me? Because until that vertical relationship between us and God is healed, until we learn how to love God, right, those horizontal relationships, how do I love my neighbor? They're going to continue to be problems, right? So until we learn to love God, it is very difficult to learn to love our neighbor. So first 4 commandments, how do you love God? Next 6 commandments, how do you love your neighbor? So question 10 actually kind of bridges both. I honestly wish they'd broken these up. But question 10 asks, what does God require in the 4th and 5th commandments? It says 4th, that on the Sabbath day, we covered this one last week, that on the Sabbath day we spend time in public and private worship of God, rest from routine employment, serve the Lord and others, and so anticipate the eternal Sabbath. 5th, that we love and honor our father and our mother, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. So I want to start today, as we jump into that, with an exercise, okay? I want to get you guys, just kind of a mental exercise. I want you guys to close your eyes for just a moment. Get you to close your eyes. Now, what I want you to do, take out your wallet, hold it out to the side. I'm just kidding, right? Don't do that. Seriously, though, close your eyes for just a minute. I want you to take for a minute, and I want you to imagine the face of your father. Let's call it up in your mind. Maybe they're still with you. Maybe they're not. I want you to ask yourself the question now, do you love your father? Do you honor your father? Now I want you to switch. I want you to see the face of your mother and ask the same question. Do you love your mother? Do you honor your mother? Now, if you have children at this point, take a moment and think through them and ask yourself the question, do they love me? Do they honor me? Okay, you can open your eyes. All right, for some of you, that was a very, very easy exercise, right? For some of you, it may have been more challenging. But Exodus 20:12 is the 5th commandment, and it reads, literally from the Bible, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. Honor your father and your mother. Okay? So let's talk about this today. What does honoring your father and your mother look like? And I want you to understand one thing first, right? Oh dear. Of course. So if you're writing things down, I'm going to try to get this thing, I don't think it quite paired right. If you're writing things down, here's the first thing you want to write. Your parents are your first neighbor. Okay? Your parents are your first neighbor. There we go. Got it. I'm learning this new technology, right? Your parents are your first neighbor. Should have had plenty of time to write that down. Listen, if the greatest commandment is to love your Lord your God with all your heart, and the second like it is to love your neighbor, it starts with your parents. Your parents are your very first neighbor, and quite frankly, they are almost assuredly, outside of maybe your spouse, to be your longest neighbor. Okay? If they are the neighbor that you're going to have, there are few relationships in your life. Maybe it's going to be your wife, maybe even longer, longer odds that it will be a close friend, will eclipse that duration. But given the average lifespan of an American, which is about 79 years, and given the average age at which we have a child for the first time, which is about 26 now, then chances are, all things kind of equal, that you are going to be in a relationship with your parents for 53 years. Okay, there is a reason that the very first thing when God says, how do you love your neighbor, he begins with your parents. They are your first and they are your longest, most likely, neighbor, perhaps outside of your spouse. And I think this also speaks to the importance of the family, right? When God gets done saying, how do we love me, right? Like, how are our vertical relationships fixed? When he begins to talk about horizontal relationships, the very first things he talks about is the family, the basic building block and structure of human existence. And I think that's an important lesson for us to hear, because as I think I prayed about this a little bit earlier, but we live in a very individualistic culture, right? That it's all about me, right? The family is kind of second. Even marriages can be second, right? It's all about, my life, my career, kind of my wants, selfies to Instagram, like the whole 9 yards. We live in a very me-centered culture. And Jesus and God say, through the fifth commandment, wait a minute, guys. The very first and most important thing in your life begins with your family. You're not first when it comes to those horizontal relationships. The family unit is first. Your duty to your mother or your father, whether they are biological or whether they are adopted, it doesn't matter, is to love and honor them first. So long after your middle school crush is over, and long after your high school girlfriend leaves you, and your friends from childhood, have most likely kind of slowly faded away, your parents will be in your life. And that first duty to your first neighbor only changes when you get married. And then the priority changes, but the length of neighborliness, right? Honor your father and your mother is the first and primary commandment when it comes to loving your neighbor. So then it kind of naturally leads to the second question. Okay, how? How do we do that? And I want to look at this really in three different stages of life, right? The Catechism in its question says, and I love the way it says it, we love and honor our father and our mother, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. That looks different as you age, okay? What loving and honoring and respecting looks like when you are a child looks different than when you're a youth and into your young adult, and looks different from when you're an adult. So I want to take these in those three kind of categories. How do you love? Well, okay, first, if you're a child, and when I say child, that's a terrible I. I'm going to redo that. When I say child, I'm talking birth to maybe, 12, 13-ish. Okay? How do you love? You obey and respect. Obey and respect. The child's primary duty, right, your children's primary duty to your parents, they are your authority. They are the ones that God has decided to put in your life, and they are ordained by God to take care of you. And I get it, right? You're not going to understand this until later in life, but it's the enormous debt that you owe them. Right, sometimes in our house we watch like the Animal Planet or Discovery Channel or something like that. You guys ever watch shows like that? Right? You see the documentaries of the mother shark that swims into the bay and gives birth to the 2 baby sharks and then says, "Good luck, I'll see you," right? And swims off. Those things are then left there, but they have everything they need in order to survive. Now, chances of survival are pretty low for all of them, right? But they don't need mom. Human children are very different. They're helpless. They need constant care and provision. They don't have the abilities and really even the instincts to survive and thrive. So children are called to submit to and obey their parents and to their godly discipline and instruction. And also to treat mom and dad with a healthy level of respect, right? Obedience talks about your actions towards your parents, right? But respect is about the attitude that you display towards your parents. Actions and attitudes are both required. Does your attitude towards your mom and dad reflect respect in your voice tone or your body language? And here's the thing too, mom and dad, right? They will obey and respect only as much as you require them to. Right? If you don't require it, they're not going to do it. Because that's just that natural, rebellious, sinful heart that we are all born with. Okay? It doesn't change, right, as you grow, right? That natural, rebellious heart is only changed by the power of the Holy Spirit and the love of Jesus, but the commandment doesn't change either as we move into the New Testament. You're like, maybe I'll get rescued by the New Testament, right? Because this is kind of Old Testament. Well, Paul says in Colossians 3:20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord, right? Children are to obey and to respect. But it changes a little bit the older that you get. So that's the requirement for a child. But how about a youth? Now I'm talking, 13-ish through college, let's say. And it really kind of depends, I think, a little bit on the age and maturity of the child. But what's the requirement here? That you respect and obey. And you're like, wait a minute. Time out. That's just what you told the little kids, right? Yes. But notice the switch in order. Okay? The change in order, right? You're growing up. Things are changing rapidly with volatility sometimes, right? You're starting to have your own ideas. You're starting to develop, hopefully, into the person that God desires you to be. Sometimes you're going to disagree with mom and dad. Shocking, right? Shocking. Some of that's okay, right? It's just part of growing up. It's okay to have a difference of opinion. It's okay to have a different idea sometimes. What's not okay is to disrespect. Because just remember, as soon as you turn 12, they can take you to Georgia and sell you to the circus. Always keep that in the back of your mind. So the most important thing with teenagers, honestly, I reverse the order on these, right, is respecting your parents. How do you talk about them? When they're around? When they're not around? How do you talk to them? How do you interact with what they have to say to you? You're not a kid anymore, right? When you make it into these teenagers' years, you're not a kid, but you're not an adult yet either. Okay, there's scientific evidence, right? Teenager brains are driven by a portion of the brain called the amygdala. It deals with emotions. It deals with impulses. It deals with aggression and instinct, right? The frontal cortex the part of your brain that deals with rational decision making, with understanding the results of decisions, like consequences, that problem solves, that controls impulses, is still developing and will not be fully developed until you're in your early to mid-20s. So in the case of teens and young adults, decisions are often overly influenced by that portion of the brain that's just based on emotions and instinct, with little concern for future consequences or what this might do to this relationship or what this is going to do to my life a year from now or 5 years from now or even 10 years from now. It's difficult sometimes to make decisions that take into account this whole world of consequences that you're now moving into. So as a youth, as a child, you're not really equipped yet to deal with that. That's why you have parents. We respect them and to recognize their experience in their life, and you talk to mom and dad, hopefully, about difficult decisions, and then you obey. Right? And there's times where you're not going to want to. But you respect and you obey. There's probably a little more negotiating room as to what level that obedience has, right? As you grow, that's going to change. You can work through that. But when it comes to your parents, you respect and obey. You say, okay, well, does that mean I have to obey them all the time? Well, I'll get to a caveat in a couple of minutes. But everything changes again when you become an adult, okay? An adult, I'm just going to say, post-college age-ish, college plus. You're not a kid anymore, right? Obedience really at this point is no longer required. At this point, it becomes love and care. And I'm going to add respect to that as well, though it's probably not going to be in the official notes in your app. Okay, you're not a kid anymore. Your relationship with your parents has changed. You're an adult now, right? You're responsible for your own life. You still respect them. You still speak to them respectfully. You still speak of them respectfully. But the primary objective in your life when it comes to mom and dad now is to love and ultimately to care for. In biblical times, when they commanded this, there were no nursing homes. Okay, there was no Social Security. There was no 401ks. There were no pensions, right? When you were young, mom and dad took care of you. And then when they got old, you took care of them. That's the way it worked. And there was maybe this time there in the middle when you guys weren't really together, but given that lifespans were much shorter back then, that time wasn't all that long. As Christian children today, whether we are 44-year-old children or 22-year-old children or 64-year-old children, we cannot abdicate our role in taking care of and caring for our parents. I'm not saying Social Security is not sinful, right? Nursing homes not sinful, right? All of that. I'm not necessarily saying any of that, but Christian children, right? We have a responsibility to love, honor, and care for mom and dad when they get old, even when it's inconvenient and difficult. If you went, sometimes back before this pandemic, we used to go down to some of the nursing homes here in the area. And sometimes when you ask some of the residents, when's the last time you saw your family, the answers would just depress you. And then you throw COVID on top of that. Man. Right, mom and dad, for you as a Christian, it's your responsibility to love them, to care for them, and to respect them. Now, that can look different in a bunch of different contexts. We've all got to kind of work through exactly where that is. But when God said, love and honor your father and your mother, it didn't mean that all the way up until the point where things get difficult. I want to give you a great example of this, actually taken out of the Bible, and it's perfectly appropriate that we get to it in Holy Week. If you've got your Bibles, it'll be up on the screen, but you can turn to John chapter 19. John chapter 19, I'm going to read from verses 25 through 27. Jesus is actually on the cross when this happens. John 19, 25 to 27. It says, "But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother, His mother Mary is there, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. There are a lot of Marys. It sometimes gets a little confusing as to which one they're talking about. Popular name. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home, right? Jesus is on the cross, and his mom is there, which had to be just this awful, awful experience for both of them. John, the author of the Gospel of John, is always there. In his gospel, he refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. He never really names himself, but that's John. Some of the other women are there. Maybe James is there. You can kind of assume that he's there because he's John's brother. Jesus is on the cross, right? He is dying on the cross for your sin and for my sin. His father, Joseph, is dead. He's been dead for a long time, right? We see Joseph as Jesus is born and in his early years and maybe even to his early teenage years, and then in that kind of blank space we have between when Jesus is 12 or 13 and when he's about 30, Joseph dies somewhere in there. We don't know why, we don't know how, we don't know what, but we know Jesus is now the oldest son, and he is responsible for his mother, right? Her care is his responsibility. So he is on the cross, and he is enduring unspeakable agony, both physical, by being nailed to the cross, right? He can't breathe. The way he's nailed on it, he's all hunched over. To breathe, he has to push up with his feet or pull up with his arms, both of which have nails driven through them. So to get a breath, you've got to pull yourself up. So it's this agonizing experience where you slowly suffocate to death. And not only that, he's experiencing the divine suffering that's coming from God, the paying for the sin. So Jesus, as he hangs here, really only has the energy, only musters up the energy to speak 7 times. And they're very short statements. And one of those times is he looks out at his mother, and he looks out at his, what I'm going to call probably his best friend, John. And he looks at Mary and he goes, "Woman, behold your son." And he looks at John and he goes, "Behold your mother." And he passes her off into John's care and says, "You take care of my mom." Honor your father and your mother. All the way up to the moment where Jesus passed. He's looking out for his mom. Church, take care of your parents. Honor your father and mother. The Bible, the Old Testament, goes on and promised, "And you will live long in the land," right? God was taking Israel to the promised land. You guys want to know how to stay here, God says? You honor your parents, and you'll live long. Honor your father and your mother, okay? Now, it kind of raises the question. Let's shift gears here for a second. What about dishonorable parents? What about ungodly parents? Tough topic. Dishonorable or ungodly. Some of you guys, I'd be willing to bet, had parents that maybe weren't good parents. The severity varies on how that went. But how do you honor maybe non-Christian parents or dishonorable parents? Got several things to say here, all of which we'll hit relatively quickly. But the first thing I'll say, number one, be gracious. Okay? Sometimes our expectations of our parents can be a little unreasonable. We need to recognize that as children, my children recognizing of me recognizing of my parents, right? That we too are sinful, broken, fallen creatures. Right? That I am just as infected by the spiritual disease of sin as everybody else is. That infects me, that infects my parents, that infects my kids, right? So there is a level of We need to be gracious. Be gracious, right? The Bible, it's a glory to overlook an offense, right? When it comes to that relationship, are there things that we just need to be gracious about and just get over? Obviously, that doesn't apply to the big stuff, but sometimes we hold mom and dad to standards that they just can't meet, right? So we need to be gracious. Second thing I'm going to say as we're kind of walking through this, respect. Man, let's back up there. And obey when possible. The commandment is written to Israel, to believers. Right? The commandment is written to those that it would be assumed are following the Mosaic law as they raise their children. It's reinforced again to Christian, but the commandment assumes that our parents are believers, which would have been very rare in the Old Testament for a child not to have a parent who was a believer. So the assumption is that they too, right, mom and dad are loving God or loving neighbor, but today that could be a very different story. It's not uncommon to have parents that don't believe, or parents that don't believe to have kids perhaps that come to faith. So what do we do, right, when there's this kind of conflict of worldviews there between parent and child or between child and parent? The answer is the call to respect broadly stays, right? Respect your parents, even if you disagree with them. And if possible, insofar as you can, obey. Unless what they're requiring and what they're commanding and what they're doing is leading you into sin. And then you have the opportunity to step back and say, respectfully, I don't know that I can do this. That's a hard thing for a child to do, whether that child is 12 or 13, or even if that child is 44 or 45, right? If possible, we should obey, unless they are instructing us to sin. And if we then say we can't, we do it respectfully. Okay, so we respect and we obey when possible. And just kind of tagging along with that, right? We disobey only to avoid sin. Right? If your parents are leading you to do something that's wrong, that you know is wrong, you disobey as respectfully as you can. Right? To lie about something, to cheat about something, to steal something. Now, I'm not talking about when they ask you to do something that you just don't want to do. Like go clean your room, right? Nope. Do your laundry. Nope. Something else. Lie about something, cheat about something, steal something. That's a little bit different. Okay? So we respect and we obey to the point that we can. But there are times when it comes that the relationship needs to be severed. Okay? It's difficult to talk about things like this. There are very, very rare cases, right, when the relationship needs to end for a period or perhaps a longer time. That's primarily the responsibility of the other parent to determine when that is. There are circumstances where a parent has done something that warrants ceasing. And let's be clear, I'm talking about, something of significance, some kind of abuse of significant severity, right? Something that needs to be told to the other parent, that parent needs to take seriously in order to protect the child. Children are to honor their father and mother, and fathers and mothers are to love and protect their children. And if things get bad enough, it may even involve ending that relationship for a little while, or maybe a long while. But ultimately, it boils down. How do you deal with dishonorable or ungodly parents? The last thing I'm going to write here is to forgive. Okay, sometimes there are things that can't be overlooked. What do you do with parents that have said bad things or done bad things or allowed bad things? Or, where do you go from there? The Bible tells us that we forgive. It doesn't say that it's going to be easy. Doesn't necessarily say that it's going to happen quickly. Right? Just say, well, okay, if we're talking about something simple, right? Forgiveness, right? Forgiveness should come within hours, maybe days, right? As we work through this stuff. If we're talking about something severe, maybe it should take a lot longer than that. But if we're having trouble with that, I mean, look back at the gospel. Right? If you really believe what the Bible has to say, then you'll have a growing appreciation for the depth and breadth of your own sin and the way it hides and disguises itself. And when you look at the cross right here in the Holy Week of Easter and at the forgiveness offered to you, you'll recognize that what's been done to you ultimately pales in significance of what we have done to God. And we are called to forgive. Now, in some cases, like I said, that may take minutes or days or a few hours. In some cases of significant damage, that could take months or even years before it happens. But here's kind of the last thing I'll leave you with on this. You say, forgive. What this bad stuff that happens, forgive. Listen, you forgive ultimately, right? Because God has called us to forgive and because that person can be potentially forgiven, right? But you forgive also to set yourself free, right? To the extent that hurt or that pain continues to fester and live in there, right? That whatever happened is going to continue to exercise a level of control over your life. Right, that it's going to influence, that it's going to affect your marriage, it's going to affect your kids, it's going to affect your job, it's going to affect everything, right? We forgive ultimately so that we can be set free from that. When we dived into this, we said, children, honor your father and mother. It's all fun and games, right? Until it's not. But the commandment, right, for almost every situation. Children, obey and respect. Youth, respect and obey. Adults, honor your father and mother. For most of us here, that will be a joyful, easy task as we go through life. Yes, there will be butting of heads. Yes, there'll be differences of opinion. But ultimately, at the end of the day, right, that relationship is going to be good and is going to be strong. And we praise God for that. And for those that it's not that way, right, your church family is here for you, to love you, to help you, to assist you. Church, honor your father and mother. Let's pray.